My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am 56 years old and I make $40,000. Not a year, a month. But my son Leo has absolutely no idea about any of this. Tonight, I was about to find out exactly what kind of family he had married into, and I was going to do it by playing a role I had perfected over the last decade. Now, you might wonder why a man making nearly $500,000 a year would pretend to be poor. Why would I drive a car with a sputtering engine and wear faded clothes from discount racks? It all started 7 years ago, when Leo was still a freshman in college. I built my tech infrastructure firm from absolute nothing. I spent sleepless nights writing code, bidding on small contracts, and slowly clawing my way up until I was landing Fortune 500 clients and securing heavily guarded government contracts. The money started flowing in. It was more money than I had ever seen in my life, but I learned a very bitter, unforgettable lesson early on. Money changes how people see you. More specifically, my ex-wife Evelyn's family taught me that lesson the hard way. The very moment they smelled the faintest hint of my success, they came circling around me like vultures in the desert. They had their hands out, they had their sob stories meticulously rehearsed. Suddenly, relationships that had been dead for 2 decades were the most important things in the world to them. When Evelyn and I divorced 28 years ago, her relatives suddenly remembered I existed only when I had a bank account worth looking at. Her cousin demanded a loan for a sure thing real estate venture. Her brother practically cornered me, insisting I should invest my hard-earned capital into his revolutionary restaurant idea, despite the fact that the man had zero experience in food service or basic management. Even her mother, a woman who used to actively mock my ambitions when I was just a struggling programmer, suddenly suggested that I owe them a cut of my wealth for supporting me when I had nothing. They completely conveniently forgot that their version of support was telling Evelyn she should leave me for someone with a real job. So I made a decision. I drove the same 2008 Toyota Camry I had owned since long before the success hit. I lived in the exact same modest, creaky 2-bedroom house. I wore unbranded, mass-produced clothes from local superstores. Whenever Leo visited me from campus, I would carefully hide my tailored Italian suits in a locked storage unit. I would park the new electric luxury sedan at my corporate office downtown and take the bus back to the Camry. When he looked at me, he saw a father who worked tirelessly, lived simply, and taught him the grueling value of every single dollar. He never knew about the diversified investment portfolios, he never knew about the 3 vacation homes I owned and rented out on the coast, and he certainly never knew that I had already set aside a $2 million trust fund for his future money. He would only ever get access to when he proved to me that he could build something sustainable himself. I wanted him to develop his own ambition. I wanted him to love me for me, not for the lifestyle I could fund for him. I refused to let him coast on his father's success and turn into an entitled nightmare. And honestly, for a long time my plan worked beautifully. Leo graduated with honors. He landed his own job at a respectable marketing firm. He never once asked me for money beyond the occasional $20 for dinner when times were incredibly tight at the end of the month. He was proud, he was fiercely independent, and he was hardworking. He was everything I had ever hoped for in a son. But 3 weeks ago, things began to shift. Leo called me with a nervous, almost frantic excitement in his voice. Chloe's parents, the Sterlings, had finally agreed to meet me. They lived in an exclusive gated community in the hills. They were old money, or at least that was the illusion they aggressively projected, according to Leo. They had been highly concerned about Chloe marrying beneath her social status. He actually used those exact words when he told me. He didn't realize how deeply each one of those syllables stung. My boy had been with Chloe for 3 years and they had been married for 1. Yet I had been strategically unavailable for every single suggested meeting until now. I knew the type of people the Sterlings were without ever having to shake their hands. But I couldn't avoid them forever. The morning of the dinner, I stood in my massive walk-in closet, running my fingers along the 2 highly distinct sections of my wardrobe. On the left side hung the designer suits, the crisp silk ties, and the polished European leather shoes. On the right side hung my Leo clothes, faded polo shirts, heavily creased khakis, and a pair of worn-out loafers with scuffed heels. I reached into the right side and pulled out a particularly unfortunate washed-out mustard polo shirt that practically screamed, "I don't know how to dress for a formal dinner." I paired it with beige khakis that were just a fraction of an inch too short. Looking at myself in the full-length mirror, I almost laughed out loud. The exact same face that had been featured on the cover of modern tech magazines just last year now looked like ever exhausted. Working-class father trying way too hard to fit in at a restrictive country club. It was absolutely perfect. I grabbed my bulky, outdated wallet and the keys to the Camry. The drive to the hills gave me plenty of time to mentally prepare for the charade. I was ready to be the version of Arthur Pendleton that everyone expected to see. As I navigated the winding roads up toward the Sterling estate, the engine of the Camry rattling slightly against the steep incline, my phone buzzed through the ancient static-filled speakers. I had to get Bluetooth installed in this old junker a year ago because I am not a complete masochist. I tapped the cracked screen to answer. It was Leo. "Hello, Leo. I am on the road right now."
Dad, you're actually coming, right? You're not going to turn around and cancel on us at the last minute again.
"I am on my way. The GPS says I should be at the gates in about 20 minutes.
Okay, good. That's good. Listen, Dad, I need to talk to you about a few things before you get here. Chloe's parents they are very particular people.
Particular in what way?
Just their lifestyle. Their standards. When you get to the property, use the side entrance near the garden. Don't go up the main steps to the double doors. And please park your car out on the main street. Don't pull the Camry into the circular driveway. Richard has his vintage cars parked out front, and they are very strict about the aesthetic of the driveway.
You want me to park on the street and use the side door, like the staff?
No, Dad, not like the staff. It's just a logistical thing. The street parking is just easier. And Dad, another thing. When we sit down, please do not ask for a beer if they offer you a drink. They are strictly wine people. They have a whole cellar.
I will stick to water, Leo. Don't worry about my beverage choices.
I just want tonight to go smoothly. And if her brother Julian starts talking to you about his investments and his tech ventures, just nod and smile at him. Don't try to debate him on the economy. He is between ventures right now, but he's very well connected.
Between ventures. I see.
And Chloe's mom, Eleanor. She might seem a little cold or distant when you first meet her. Do not take it personally. She is like that with absolutely everyone who is not originally from their circle. It just takes her a while to warm up to outsiders.
Their circle. You say that as if you are officially inside of it now.
I am just trying to make a good impression, Dad. I've been working hard to fit in with them. Just try to make a good impression too, okay? Maybe don't mention the car. And if Richard asks you about your work, just say you do freelance consulting. They do not need all the details about your little contracts and your computer repairs. Keep it vague.
My little contracts. Got it.
I'm not trying to be rude, Dad. I just know how they operate. They value pedigree and background. I don't want them making you feel uncomfortable because you don't understand their world.
Don't worry about me, Leo. I will be on my absolute best behavior. I will be exactly myself. I won't embarrass you in front of the Sterlings.
Thank you, Dad. Drive safe. Use the side gate when you arrive. I will be waiting inside.
See you in 20 minutes. I disconnected the call. The silence in the car felt incredibly heavy. My own son had just coached me on how to be less of an embarrassment to a family of pretentious strangers. I gripped the steering wheel, looking at the massive mansions passing by my windows. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was walk right into it. The drive into the exclusive gated community in the hills was a masterclass in American architectural ostentation. The roads were perfectly paved, devoid of even a single crack or blemish. Winding upward through a meticulously landscaped paradise that required thousands of gallons of water a day to maintain in the dry Californian climate. As my 2008 Toyota Camry sputtered toward the imposing iron security gates, the uniformed guard stepped out of his booth. He did not smile. He looked at the rusted bumper of my car, then at my washed-out mustard polo shirt, and his posture immediately stiffened into a wall of authoritative suspicion. I gave him my name. and I could see the absolute disbelief in his eyes as he cross-referenced his digital guest list. He clearly assumed I was a lost delivery driver or a misguided handyman who had taken a wrong turn. When he finally found the name Arthur Pendleton listed under the Sterling residence, he handed my driver's license back with a slow, deliberate motion, as if touching it might contaminate him. The heavy iron gates slowly parted, and I drove my rattling vehicle into a neighborhood where every single house looked less like a home and more like a fortified monument to ego. The properties were sprawling estates with massive pillars, wraparound driveways, and manicured hedges that looked like they were trimmed with surgical precision. It was the quintessential American dream, sterilized and packaged for those who wanted to project an image of untouchable supremacy. I followed the GPS coordinates until I reached the Sterling estate. It was, by all accounts, a massive house of mirrors. It was a sprawling, modern colonial monstrosity that tried entirely too hard to look like it had been standing there for a century. The stonework was immaculate, the windows were enormous, and the entire property screamed of desperate, calculated wealth. Following Leo's humiliating instructions to the letter, I did not turn into the grand circular driveway. Instead, I drove past it, my eyes catching the gleam of Richard Sterling's heavily polished vintage automobiles parked out front. There was a pristine 1960s Jaguar and a perfectly restored classic Mercedes. They were parked strategically angled just right, so that anyone driving past would have to admire them. They were museum pieces. Trophies meant to assert dominance over anyone who approached the front door. I pulled my faded, rattling Camry up to the curb on the public street, parallel parking it carefully so as not to scrape the expensive tires of the neighboring luxury SUV. Turning off the engine, I sat in the silence for a long moment. I looked down at my worn-out loafers and the cheap khakis. My son had asked me to park on the street like a second-class citizen, so my mere existence wouldn't ruin his in-laws' carefully curated driveway aesthetic. The sting of that realization was profound, but I swallowed it down. I was here to play a part, and I was going to play it flawlessly. Getting out of the car, I walked up the side of the property, my cheap shoes crunching softly against the decorative gravel. I bypassed the sweeping marble staircase leading to the grand double doors of the main entrance and instead navigated a narrow winding path through a dense rose garden. The path led to a discreet, heavy wooden door tucked away near the rear of the estate. The delivery entrance, the servant's door, the entrance reserved for the people who were meant to be invisible. I pressed the small, unadorned doorbell. Moments later, the door swung open, revealing a man dressed in a crisp, formal suit who could only be the butler. He looked me up and down, his eyes performing a rapid, merciless inventory of my attire. His expression remained entirely neutral, but the slight tightening around his eyes betrayed his immense disdain. He did not say a word. He simply stepped aside and gestured for me to enter with a stiff flick of his wrist. I stepped over the threshold into a sterile, stainless steel service hallway that smelled strongly of industrial bleach and roasting garlic. The butler led me through the massive high-tech kitchen where private catering staff were frantically preparing intricate dishes. No one looked up at me. I was a ghost in their workspace. We transitioned through a set of heavy swinging doors and the environment instantly transformed. The clinical brightness of the kitchen gave way to the warm, suffocating opulence of the grand foyer. The ceilings soared 30 feet high, dominated by a cascading crystal chandelier that looked violently heavy. The floors were imported Italian marble, polished to such a high sheen that I could clearly see the reflection of my scuffed shoes. The walls were adorned with massive, abstract paintings that looked incredibly expensive but entirely devoid of soul. The air was thick with the scent of heavy, expensive perfume and burning cedar from a massive fireplace. And there, standing in the center of the sunken living room, like royalty holding court, were the Sterlings. Richard Sterling was a tall, remarkably well-groomed man who looked like he had stepped directly out of a country club promotional brochure. His silver hair was swept back perfectly, and he wore a tailored navy blazer with a silk pocket square that matched his expensive loafers. Beside him stood his wife Eleanor, a woman whose face was pulled incredibly tight, projecting a mask of permanent icy judgment. She wore a minimalist designer dress that draped over her thin frame, and she held a delicate crystal glass of amber liquid with a white-knuckled grip. Lounging on a massive leather sofa was their son Julian. He was in his late 20s, dressed in an oversized designer sweater and distressed jeans that probably cost more than my first car. He was scrolling through his phone, looking entirely bored with the entire concept of human interaction, and standing near the fireplace, looking visibly pale and rigid, was my son Leo, alongside his wife Chloe. Leo's eyes widened slightly in panic as he took in my outfit. I stepped forward, pasting a wide, overly eager smile on my face. I adopted the exact posture of a man who was utterly overwhelmed and deeply intimidated by his surroundings. I rounded my shoulders slightly, shoved my hands awkwardly into my pockets and shuffled forward. Richard set his glass down on a marble table and approached me, extending a hand. When I took it, he squeezed my fingers with an aggressive, bone-crushing force. A classic transparent power move meant to establish dominance immediately. I let my hand go slightly limp, allowing him to win the silent physical contest. He introduced himself with a booming theatrical voice that echoed off the high ceilings, making sure I understood entirely that this was his kingdom and I was merely a peasant granted temporary entry. Eleanor did not step forward. She offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod from across the room, her eyes doing a slow, brutal sweep of my mustard polo shirt. I could practically hear the cash register in her head ringing up the exact low dollar value of my entire existence. Julian finally looked up from his phone. He did not stand, he simply threw up a lazy hand in greeting and immediately returned his attention to the glowing screen. Chloe, to her credit, walked over and gave me a polite, if somewhat tense, hug. But it was Leo's reaction that truly broke my heart. He did not come over to embrace me. He stood, rooted to his spot by the fireplace, his jaw tight, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. He looked at me not with the warmth of a son welcoming his father, but with the sheer terror of a junior employee watching a liability walk into a boardroom. He quickly interjected, suggesting we all move to the dining room for dinner. He wanted to get this over with. He wanted to minimize the exposure. He wanted to hide me away as quickly as possible. As we walked toward the massive dining hall, I maintained my facade of the bumbling, awestruck working-class father. I let my eyes wander wildly at the architecture. I made an entirely inappropriate comment about how big the ceiling was, and I deliberately bumped my shoulder against a doorframe. The Sterlings exchanged silent knowing glances. They had entirely categorized me, boxed me up, and dismissed me within the first 5 minutes. The trap was fully set, and the game had officially begun. The dining room was an intimidating cavern of mahogany and heavy velvet drapes designed explicitly to make guests feel small. A massive, heavily polished dining table stretched across the length of the room, set for 6 people. The table setting was an absolute minefield of formal etiquette. There were multiple forks, intricate silver knives, delicate crystal water goblets, and heavily embroidered linen napkins. I could see the immediate tension in Eleanor's shoulders as she watched me approach the table. She was waiting for me to make a mistake. She was waiting for me to grab the wrong fork or sit in the wrong chair. Richard confidently took his place at the head of the table, commanding the room. Eleanor sat directly to his right, and Julian took the seat to his left. Chloe and Leo were seated further down. I was directed to the very far end of the table, seated at the corner closest to the swinging kitchen door. It was the purgatory seat. It was the furthest possible physical distance from the center of power in the room, constantly interrupted by the bustling catering staff coming in and out. I sat down heavily, intentionally scraping the legs of my heavy wooden chair against the floor, watching Richard visibly wince at the sound. As soon as we were seated, the butler appeared from the shadows like a well-trained phantom, carrying 2 distinct bottles of wine. He approached Richard first, presenting an old, dust-covered bottle of 1998 Bordeaux. Richard nodded with a look of profound self-satisfaction, and the butler poured the dark, rich liquid into the massive crystal glasses for Richard Eleanor, Julian, Chloe and Leo. Then the butler walked all the way down to my end of the table. He did not pour from the dusty Bordeaux bottle. Instead, he smoothly produced a second bottle from behind his back, a generic mass-produced table wine with a bright, cheap-looking label. It was the kind of wine you buy from the bottom shelf of a gas station for $8. Without a word, he poured it into my glass. The insult was so deliberate, so perfectly orchestrated, that I actually felt a brief moment of admiration for their cruelty. They weren't just treating me like I was poor. They were making sure that I physically consumed my lower status. I looked down the table at Leo. He had watched the entire wine exchange. He knew exactly what they had just done. But he simply picked up his glass of expensive Bordeaux, took a long sip, and stared intently at his plate. He chose silence. The first course arrived. It was a minuscule pretentious portion of seared scallops resting on a smear of vibrant green puree. As the silver forks clinked against the expensive china, Richard leaned back in his chair, swirling his wineglass and locked his eyes on me. The interrogation began. He asked me with a thick layer of patronizing curiosity what exactly I did for a living. Following Leo's exact instructions, I played the fool. I spoke slowly, slightly lowering my voice, and told him that I did freelance computer consulting. I described my work in the most mundane, uninspiring terms possible. I told him I fixed slow hard drives, helped small local businesses set up their email servers, and occasionally replaced cracked laptop screens. I made myself sound like an aging, obsolete technician barely surviving on the scraps of the digital age. Richard chuckled a deep, condescending sound that vibrated in his chest. He immediately launched into a lengthy, unsolicited lecture about the importance of scalable business models and aggressive investment portfolios. He spoke to me as if I were a financially illiterate teenager who needed basic economics explained to him. I simply nodded, widening my eyes in feigned awe, occasionally uttering small sounds of agreement. Eleanor chimed in next, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet malice. She asked me where I usually shopped for my clothes, noting that my mustard polo shirt was a very brave and unique color choice for an evening dinner. She didn't wait for my answer before turning to Chloe to discuss a recent trip to Milan for bespoke tailoring. They were systematically dismantling my dignity brick by brick, right in front of my son. And then Julian took the stage. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and began boasting loudly about his newest tech venture. He claimed he was developing an artificial intelligence app that was going to entirely disrupt the global logistics industry. He threw around massive buzzwords, blockchain, neural networks, synergistic paradigms, with the supreme confidence of a man who had absolutely no idea what any of those words actually meant. I sat there in my purgatory seat, eating my tiny scallop, and listened to him. In my head, I automatically began dismantling his entire business model. Within 3 minutes, I recognized that his app was fundamentally flawed. The backend architecture he was describing was entirely incompatible with existing global shipping databases. The encryption standards he casually mentioned had been rendered obsolete by federal security regulations 2 years ago. The entire project was an empty, hollow shell, a classic piece of Silicon Valley vaporware designed to separate foolish investors from their money. It was nothing but smoke and mirrors, much like the Sterling family themselves. But I didn't say a word. I just smiled, took a sip of my terrible metallic-tasting wine, and told Julian that his idea sounded very complicated and smart. Julian smirked, clearly satisfied that he had dazzled the simple-minded peasant at the end of the table. Throughout this entire agonizing ordeal, Leo said nothing. My son, the boy I had raised to be strong, to be independent, to stand up for what was right, had completely folded. Every time Richard made a cutting remark about my financial status, Leo would flinch, but he kept his mouth tightly shut. Every time Eleanor made a subtle jab at my appearance, Leo would nervously wipe his mouth with his napkin and look away. He was terrified of losing his place in this house of mirrors. He was terrified of being associated with the man who had supposedly raised him in poverty. He was sacrificing me on the altar of their approval. The physical distance between us at the table was nothing compared to the emotional chasm that had suddenly opened up. As the main course was served, a comically small piece of heavily sauced Wagyu beef, I realized that the charade had run its course. I had seen everything I needed to see. I had tasted their condescension. I had witnessed their cruelty. And most importantly, I had seen my son's true priorities. It was time to pull the curtain back. It was time to show the Sterlings exactly who they had invited through their delivery door. The heavy silence of the dining room was suddenly shattered by a sharp, aggressive buzzing. My phone, sitting inside the breast pocket of my faded polo shirt, was vibrating intensely. The sound was incredibly loud against the quiet clinking of silverware. Richard stopped cutting his Wagyu beef. Eleanor's eyes snapped toward me, narrowing in absolute disgust. Using a mobile phone at the dinner table was a massive breach of their precious etiquette, and they were ready to crucify me for it. I slowly pulled the phone from my pocket. It was Marcus, my chief financial officer. Marcus knew I was at a family dinner, and I had given him strict, undeniable orders never to call me during personal hours unless the sky was actively falling or a major contract required immediate, irrevocable authorization. I looked directly into Richard's furious eyes. I did not apologize. I did not excuse myself from the table. I simply tapped the green button and held the phone to my ear. "Yes, Marcus, tell me." The silence in the dining room was so absolute that the muffled, panicked voice of my CFO could be faintly heard through the receiver. I listened for exactly 10 seconds. My face remained entirely devoid of emotion, a blank slate that I had perfected during hundreds of high-stakes boardroom negotiations. The Department of Defense clearance came through. Excellent. No, do not accept their initial restructuring terms. Tell them we are holding firm at 85 million for the initial rollout. If they want the proprietary encryption architecture, they pay the premium. If they balk, tell the general I will pull the servers offline by midnight and they can go back to using carrier pigeons. Draft the counter-proposal and send it to my secure terminal. I will sign it tonight. I lowered the phone and tapped the screen to end the call. The atmosphere in the dining room had fundamentally altered. The air felt thick, heavy, and suddenly extremely hard to breathe. Richard's fork was frozen halfway to his mouth. Eleanor was staring at me, her tight face suddenly looking very old and deeply confused. Julian had stopped chewing completely, his jaw hanging slightly open. Even the butler, standing in the shadows, had stiffened. $85 million. The Department of Defense. These were not the words of a struggling computer repairman who used the delivery entrance. I placed the phone down on the table, but I wasn't finished. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my thick leather wallet. I opened it slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a single card. I tossed it onto the polished mahogany table. It hit the wood with a heavy, distinct metallic thud. It was the American Express Centurion card, the black card, forged from anodized titanium. It was an invitation-only financial instrument issued only to individuals with a net worth that defied ordinary comprehension. It sat there on the white linen tablecloth, absorbing the light from the crystal chandelier, radiating an immense, undeniable power. Underneath the table, I saw Julian's hands moving frantically. He had pulled his phone out and was aggressively typing. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was googling Arthur Pendleton. It took less than 10 seconds. I watched the blood completely drain from Julian's face. He looked at his screen, then looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, overwhelming terror. He whispered something to his father. Richard snatched the phone from his son's hands. He looked at the screen. He saw the articles. He saw the Forbes features. He saw the massive tech infrastructure conglomerate that bore my name. The man sitting at the end of his table in the purgatory seat drinking the $8 gas station wine was worth more than his entire bloodline. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The power dynamic did not just shift, it violently inverted. I did not look at Richard. I did not look at Eleanor or Julian. They were completely irrelevant to me now. They were insects. I slowly pushed my chair back, the wood scraping loudly against the floor again, and I stood up to my full height. I turned my head and locked my eyes exclusively on the boy sitting near the middle of the table. Leo.
Dad, I didn't know. I mean, what is this? What is happening?
What is happening is that I am leaving, but before I walk out of the delivery door you so kindly requested I use, you and I are going to have a conversation, right here, right now.
Dad, please, let's just calm down. We can talk about this in private. You don't have to do this here.
I don't have to do this here. You sat in that chair for an hour, Leo. You sat there drinking their vintage wine, eating their food, while they systematically degraded, humiliated, and insulted the man you believed was a struggling, hard-working father. You watched them pour me garbage wine while you drank from crystal. You listened to them mock my clothes. You listened to this boy next to you lie about a fraudulent business and you let him talk down to me. And you did absolutely nothing. You chose silence.
I was just trying to keep the peace. You don't understand how they are. I just wanted them to accept me, Dad. I just wanted them to think I belonged here. If I caused a scene, it would have ruined everything.
Belonged here. Look around you, Leo. Look at these people. You traded your integrity, your spine, and your respect for your own blood, just so you could sit at a table with people who evaluate human worth based on the car parked in the driveway. I didn't hide my wealth from you to punish you. I hid it because I wanted you to build character. I wanted you to understand that a man's value is not measured by the numbers in his bank account, but by how he stands up when the world tries to push him down.
Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know you had this kind of money. If I had known...
If you had known what? If you had known I was a multimillionaire, you would have defended me. That is exactly the problem, Leo. That is the tragedy. You should have defended the man driving the broken Camry. You should have defended the man wearing the cheap shirt. Because that man was your father, and he loved you. And he worked his hands to the bone for you. You only regret your silence now, because you see the titanium card on the table.
That's not fair. You lied to me. You manipulated this whole night. You set me up to fail.
I didn't set you up to fail. I gave you an opportunity to show me who you really are when the pressure is on. I built an empire from absolutely nothing, Leo. I deal with sharks and wolves every single day. I needed to know if my son was a wolf or if he was just another sheep willing to be sheared for a little bit of social comfort. Tonight, you showed me exactly who you are. And it breaks my heart. I reached down, picked up my black card and slid it smoothly back into my cheap, bulky wallet. I turned away from the table, away from the shattered illusions of the Sterling family, and began the long walk back toward the kitchen doors. I took 3 heavy steps toward the swinging kitchen doors before I stopped entirely. The silence in the dining room behind me was absolute, thick enough to suffocate on. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting on the polished brass pushplate of the door, staring at my distorted reflection in the metal. I had walked away from the table, but I realized the lesson was incomplete. I had exposed my truth, but I had not yet exposed theirs. I slowly turned around, letting my hand fall away from the door. The entire Sterling family was frozen in place exactly as I had left them, a tragic tableau of shattered egos and sudden paralyzing fear. Richard was still gripping Julian's smartphone, his knuckles stark white against the dark casing, his eyes glued to the screen as if reading his own obituary. Eleanor looked physically ill. Her posture entirely collapsed, the arrogant tightness of her face replaced by the hollow, sunken reality of a woman whose entire universe had just violently collapsed. Julian was staring at the floor, breathing shallowly, realizing that his grand performance had been a spectacular failure. I walked slowly back toward the table, the heavy thud of my cheap loafers echoing off the soaring mahogany walls. And I stopped at the head of the table, looking directly down at Richard Sterling. "Did you honestly believe I didn't know who you were, Richard?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet, lacking all the forced timidity I had displayed earlier. "Did you really think a man in my position, a man who handles federal defense contracts and secures data infrastructures for global conglomerates, walks into a stranger's house without doing a complete exhaustive background check?" I watched the remaining color drain completely from his face. His lips parted, but no sound came out. "I know exactly who you are. And more importantly, I know exactly what you are hiding. I know about the massive, suffocating amount of debt this family is currently drowning in. I know that this sprawling, magnificent estate you used to intimidate people has a second and now a third, highly leveraged mortgage attached to it. I know that the pristine vintage Jaguar and the classic Mercedes parked strategically in your driveway are not owned. They are leased on predatory terms that you have been struggling to meet for the past 6 months. Eleanor let out a sharp, terrified gasp, bringing a trembling hand up to cover her mouth. Chloe's head snapped toward her mother, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. Realizing in real time that her entire childhood and family legacy was built on a foundation of sand. I did not break eye contact with Richard. You sit there drinking a 1998 Bordeaux, passing judgment on my faded shirt and my battered car, while your own credit portfolio is currently dangling on the absolute edge of Chapter 11 bankruptcy. You are operating a house of cards, Richard. A beautiful, heavily manicured, deeply tragic house of cards. And Julian, I said, shifting my gaze to the young man who was now visibly trembling in his oversized designer sweater. Your revolutionary artificial intelligence application isn't a business venture, it's a desperate, last-ditch Hail Mary attempt to secure seed money from foolish investors so you can quietly funnel those funds back into your father's failing accounts to keep the lights on in this ridiculous museum. Julian swallowed hard, looking away, completely unable to meet my eyes. The absolute humiliation of being utterly dismantled in front of his family by the very man he had spent the last hour mocking had finally broken him. You see, Richard, we continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of sympathy. There is a profound difference between being rich and acting rich. Acting rich requires an audience, it requires a performance, it requires you to constantly look down on others to artificially elevate your own fragile sense of self-worth. It requires you to pour generic wine into a guest's glass just to remind yourself that you are supposedly the king of the castle. But true wealth is silent. It does not need to boast. It does not need validation from strangers. It gives you the ultimate freedom, the freedom to wear a $5 shirt, drive a deeply flawed car, and sit quietly at the end of a table while fools talk down to you, knowing all the while that you could buy their entire existence with a single phone call. I looked at Leo one last time. He was completely devastated, tears streaming silently down his face, the gravity of his colossal mistake finally crushing his chest. Remember this feeling, Leo, I said softly, the anger finally leaving my voice, replaced by a profound, heavy sorrow. Remember the taste of this dinner. Remember what it costs to buy a seat at a table where you don't belong, surrounded by people who have nothing real to offer. With that final statement, I turned my back on the Sterling family forever. I pushed through the swinging wooden doors and stepped back into the massive high-tech catering kitchen. The atmosphere in the kitchen had undergone a radical transformation. The private chefs and the catering staff who had previously treated me like an invisible ghost were standing completely still, their eyes wide as saucers. The acoustics of the house had clearly carried every single word of my dismantling speech through the doors. They stared at me with a mixture of absolute shock and profound, undeniable respect. I didn't say a word to them, I simply gave a polite nod, walked past the stainless steel prep stations, and made my way toward the heavy wooden delivery door. The stiff, arrogant butler was already standing by the exit. As I approached, he didn't give me the cold, condescending flick of the wrist. Instead, he reached out, opened the heavy door and gave me a deep, formal bow, his eyes fixed firmly on the polished floor. It was a tragic, ironic validation respect, given not for the content of my character, but for the sudden revelation of my net worth. I stepped past him without a glance and walked out into the cool, dark Californian night. The immediate contrast between the suffocating perfumed air of the Sterling estate and the crisp, fresh night air was incredibly grounding. I took a deep breath, letting the tension slowly drain from my shoulders. The decorative gravel crunched loudly beneath my cheap loafers as I walked down the long winding path through the rose garden, bypassing the grand marble staircase one last time. I walked out onto the public street, entirely ignoring the least vintage cars in the driveway, and approached my battered 2008 Toyota Camry. It sat there, beneath the pale glow of a street lamp, its rusted bumper and chipped paint looking entirely out of place in the neighborhood of millionaires. But to me, in that specific moment, it was the most beautiful, honest object I had seen all night. It was real, it owed nothing to anyone. I pulled my keys out of my pocket, the metal clinking loudly in the quiet neighborhood, and reached for the door handle. Just as my fingers touched the cold metal of the car door, I heard the massive, heavy double doors of the main estate violently swing open. The sound of frantic, rushing footsteps echoed down the driveway, loud against the perfectly paved concrete. "Dad, wait, Dad, please don't go!" The voice belonged to Leo. It was raw, broken, and filled with an absolute, desperate panic. I turned around, leaning my back against the side of the Camry, and watched as my son and his wife sprinted down the driveway toward the street. They had completely abandoned their refined country club composure. Leo had torn off his expensive silk tie, and Chloe was struggling to run in her designer heels, practically tripping over her own dress in her haste to catch me. They reached the edge of the street, both of them panting heavily, looking completely disheveled and entirely stripped of the arrogant facade they had worn inside. Leo stopped a few feet away from me, his chest heaving, his face red and streaked with tears. He looked at me, truly looked at me for the first time that entire evening. He didn't see the mustard polo shirt or the bumbling, naive father. He saw the man who had raised him, the man who had protected him. The man he had utterly betrayed for a moment of shallow social acceptance. Dad Leo choked out his voice, trembling uncontrollably. "I am so sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I was a coward. I was so blinded by everything, by the house, by the money, by the way they talked, that I lost my mind. I sat there and let them humiliate you. I let them treat you like dirt, and I didn't say a single word. I hate myself for it. I will never, ever forgive myself for what I did tonight." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his profound shame. Before I could respond, Chloe stepped forward. She looked entirely different from the composed, slightly tense woman I had greeted inside. The illusion of her flawless upbringing had been completely shattered, and the devastation was written all over her face. "Mr. Pendleton," she said, her voice shaking but carrying a sudden, fierce conviction. "I want to apologize. Not just for my husband's silence, but for my family, for my parents, for my brother. I always suspected that things were not right. I saw the late notices. I heard the hushed, panicked arguments late at night when they thought I was asleep, but I was too afraid to confront it. I was too comfortable living in the lie. But watching them try to destroy a kind, hard-working man just to make themselves feel powerful, watching them expose their absolute lack of humanity, it made me sick to my stomach." She reached out and grabbed Leo's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We don't want any part of that world anymore. We don't want the fake prestige. We don't want the toxic debt. We are walking away from them." I looked at the two of them standing there in the street under the dim amber glow of the streetlights. They were young, foolish, and deeply flawed, but in this moment they were finally awake. "Leo," I said, my voice calm, projecting across the quiet street. "I did not orchestrate this evening to destroy your marriage or to publicly execute your in-laws. I did this because you were standing on the edge of a very dangerous cliff and you were about to jump off. You were about to spend the rest of your life chasing a mirage. You were going to buy cars you couldn't afford, houses you didn't need, and clothes that didn't fit your soul, all to impress people who would abandon you the second your bank account ran dry. That is exactly what Evelyn's family tried to do to me, and I swore to God I would never let my son fall into that same trap." I pushed off the car and took a step toward them. "I have a trust fund set up for you, Leo. $2 million sitting in a highly diversified, secure portfolio. It has been there since you graduated high school." Leo's head snapped up, his eyes widening in absolute shock, his jaw dropping open. Chloe gasped. "But hear me very clearly," I continued, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for misunderstanding. "You are not getting a single penny of it right now. If I handed you that money tonight, it would ruin you. You would use it to buy your way into another circle of vipers. You would use it to mask your insecurities. Money is an amplifier, Leo. If you are empty, arrogant and foolish, money will just make you an empty, arrogant, wealthy fool. If you have character, integrity and honor, money will give you the tools to change the world. Leo wiped his eyes, standing up straighter, absorbing the harsh, uncompromising reality of my words. I don't want the money, Dad, he said, his voice finally finding a steady, genuine pitch. I really don't. I just want my father back. I want you to look at me the way you used to. I want to learn. Chloe and I, we have nothing but our salaries. We live in a small apartment. But we want to build something real, from the ground up. We don't want the Sterling playbook. We want yours. Will you please teach us? Will you show us how to do it right? Chloe nodded vigorously beside him, her expression determined. Leaving the grand estate behind without a single backward glance, I looked deeply into my son's eyes. I searched for any lingering trace of the superficial boy who had sat at that dining table, paralyzed by the fear of losing status. He was gone. The crucible of the evening had burned away the pretentious exterior, leaving behind a raw, painful, but incredibly genuine foundation. The lesson had been brutal, but it had worked. I finally allowed a small, tired, but genuine smile to touch the corners of my mouth. It is going to be incredibly difficult, I warned them. I am not going to give you handouts. I am going to make you read balance sheets until your eyes bleed. I am going to teach you how to negotiate without ego, how to fail with grace, and how to identify the sharks before they smell blood in the water. It will be the hardest thing you have ever done. We're ready, Leo said, gripping his wife's hand tighter. We're ready to do the work. I nodded slowly, feeling a massive weight finally lift from my chest. The generational curse of toxic materialism had been broken. All right, I said, opening the door of the Camry. Come to my office downtown on Monday morning at 6 a.m. sharp. Use the front door. And Leo, don't wear a tie. I climbed into the torn driver's seat, inserted the key and turned the ignition. The old engine coughed, sputtered and finally roared to life, the familiar rattling sound filling the quiet neighborhood. I put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, leaving the magnificent, bankrupt Sterling estate in my rearview mirror. As I drove down the winding hill back toward the city, the truth of the night settled profoundly in my mind. Money does not define you. It never has and it never will. Money merely pulls back the curtain, strips away the polite fictions and ultimately reveals exactly who you have been all along.